Hey everybody, Joe Casabona here, and today I want to answer a question that I get a lot in my podcast liftoff course and from people who are just looking to start a podcast. And that is, do I need to buy a domain or register a domain for my podcast? The short technical answer is no. You don't need to register a separate domain to set up a podcast. You could go to castos.com, which is what I recommend, or anchor.fm if you're looking for a free alternative, and you can create your podcast without having a separate domain. Your feed will be whatever.castos.com/feed or something like that. So you can publish podcast episodes without having your own custom domain. However, I would strongly recommend that you get one. And that's because you're protecting your brand and your name. I have howibuilt.it for my podcast for the show How I Built It. I want to make sure that if people are going to something that is the name of my podcast, they are making it to my podcast. And I have a couple of other domains too that point there. So when you buy the domain, the follow-up question that I get is, do I need to have a separate website for my podcast? And generally, I'll say this. Why are you starting the podcast? If it's to advance a brand that you already have or your personal brand, then I think it's okay to have the podcast on your current website. So if I were to release the Joe Casabona Show, I wouldn't buy the joecasabonashow.com just to set up the podcast. I would set up casabona.org/show or /podcast, and that's where my podcast would live. In fact, I tried to do this very thing with creatorcourses.com. I had a separate podcast called Creator Toolkit, and I didn't feel like it should live on its own domain because I wanted all of that content to be under Creator Courses. So I moved all of the episodes to the blog and I took down Creator Toolkit. So if your podcast is somehow related to a website you already have, I think it's okay to have the podcast live on that website. If your show is totally different, or you're not quite established yet, or you think the content should stand up on its own, like I did with How I Built It, then you should have a separate living website for your podcast. So, to recap, you don't need to buy a domain, but I strongly recommend it. And if you need a place to buy a domain, I would recommend hover.com, but Namecheap is also really good, and you can usually get a good deal on the first year. I'll link both of those in the description below. And so you don't need to buy one, but I would strongly recommend it. As for where your podcast lives and where you're going to put your podcast content, if it is related to a website you already have, I think it's okay to keep the podcast there. And then you could point that domain to your website. So again, if I were to have the joecasabonashow.com, I might redirect the joecasabonashow.com to casabona.org/podcast. But if you are setting up some new content and you think it should stand on its own, if you're making it its own brand, then the domain should point to its own website for your podcast. Now, if you are confused about any of this, that's perfectly okay. I have a course called Podcast Liftoff, and I have a companion course to go along with it called Podcast Liftoff Website. So you'll learn how to start your podcast, and then you'll learn how to build a website for your podcast. No code required. So I'll link that in the description below too. That's over at podcastliftoff.com. Thanks so much for watching. If you have any questions, feel free to leave them in the comments below. If you liked this video, be sure to click the thumbs up button and subscribe to this channel for more great content.